Why, yes, I believe we shall.
Oh, I got a live one here.
Live from Little Rock, it's Shane Plays Radio, Geek Talk Radio, a journey into the things we love. I'm your host, Shane Stacks. Thanks so much for joining us, whether you're listening live on Saturday at 1 o'clock in the Central Arkansas, Little Rock metro area on 96.5 FM. The Answer, or if you're listening anywhere around the world, we've had tweets as far away as Argentina and the United Kingdom during the show via the live stream at 96.5 FM, theanswer.com. Glad to have you. And if you're listening delayed by podcast or on Krypton Radio or on YouTube, I'm just glad to have you. I love you listening to the show however you listen. However, this is first and foremost talk radio, geek talk radio. And I do that so that it can be interactive. So if people want to participate during the show, they can call in at 501-823-0965, or they can tweet me at Shane Plays. That's 501-823-0965, or you can tweet me at Shane Plays. Speaking of Shane Plays, shaneplays.com. When the podcast version of the show goes out, there will be show notes. So if you're listening by podcast, you can go see links and whatnot for what we talk about today. And I also archive the show on the blog at shaneplays.com. Last week's show was a geek news tsunami with friend of the show and fellow geek Neil Carter. We had a lot of fun just going through news items. I love just going over geek news, but I try not to do it as much when I have guests on because it eats into their time. So every now and then I'll just do a full geek show and or geek news show and just go through geek news after geek news. And that was last week. So you can go listen to that on podcast, or actually that's playing this weekend on Krypton Radio, a week delayed. So we do go out as a podcast on the blog at shaneplays.com, iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and SoundCloud. Remember, we're on SoundCloud now, folks, and the show's getting discovered there. And I also posted up on my YouTube channel, which also has other things like Let's Plays and recaps of D&D games and going over RPG rules and that sort of thing. So it's a cool YouTube channel if you haven't checked it out. And finally, last but never, ever, ever, ever least, we are played a week delayed on Saturdays and Mondays on Krypton Radio. KryptonRadio.com is SciFi for your Wi-Fi. All right, I got the official housekeeping notes and yapping out of the way. So Zach, how you doing, my intrepid engineer?
I'm doing all right.
All right, man. And you're going to go watch, I'm probably going to get some nasty emails for this, but you're going to go watch midget wrestling today with Dave Ellswick?
Yes, I am. Mm-hmm.
At the ballpark?
Yes.
Okay. So are they setting up like an arena at the ball game? I mean, how is this going to work?
I think there's going to be a small ring set up, I guess, behind home base or whatever.
Okay.
And, it's just going to be one match, I believe, for 25 minutes.
And then Dave is throwing out the first pitch.
The first pitch.
Okay.
Yes.
Anyway, well, just to, because somebody out there just got triggered, let's just move right on and introduce our guests. Welcoming back to the show. So glad to have them back on. I've been looking for a reason to have them back on, and now I've got them back on together. And they are like peanut butter and chocolate. They're amazing on their own, but together they become something even more. I've got D&D and RPG authors and historians, Michael Witwer, who wrote Empire of the Imagination, which is sort of a novelized but factually accurate biography of Gary Gygax, the co-creator of D&D. And then we're joined again by Jon Peterson, who wrote Playing at the World, which, as far as I know, is the deepest dive into like a scholarly approach to how did we get role-playing games? Where did it all come from? From a very scholarly but readily or easily readable and accessible way. So if you haven't read either of those books, shame on you, and go out and get them right now. So Mike and Jon, are you with me?
We're with you.
Here. I'm thrilled to be here.
Okay, so that first voice was Jon Peterson, also known as the Docetist on Twitter, and the second voice was Mike Witwer. So guys, welcome back to the show. Really, really glad to have you on the show today, and I think this is going to be a really interesting topic. As far as I know, I've never seen an article or heard a podcast or anything like that dedicated to the topic we're going to do today. Have either of you?
That's negative on my side.
Yeah.
Mike and I will both sit here like waiting to see who's going to talk first.
First. Okay.
Exactly.
I'll start going. Okay. So for this before I'll go, okay, John, or okay, Mike, just to
Right.
let you guys jump in there. So as far as I know, this is unique. Somebody may have done it, but I haven't run across it. So it's an experiment in Geek Talk Radio and podcast out there. Guys, we're going to get to that time. And folks, the topic's going to be, we'll get to it here in a couple of minutes, but the topic is going to be what if, like the old Marvel what if comic books, where they would change something and say, what would have, they would take a critical moment in Marvel history and change something. What if the Fantastic Four had never been, or what if Spider-Man had saved Gwen Stacy, or what if the Punisher had become Venom, or, what if Wolverine fought Conan? They would just propose these fantastic things and then tell these really great stories with them. So what we're going to talk about today is, what if D&D had never been published? What if D&D, the game, had never been published? What would be the ramifications to the RPG hobby and really pop culture in general? Because it has had a massive influence. What would have happened? What would have filled the void? Would something have filled the void? So we'll be digging into that later and in the show. And I think that we have two of the best minds on the show to dig into that, because both of these fine authors and historians have done fantastic work in the history of role-playing games and D&D. So first, guys, I've got to do my patented and guaranteed to please somebody somewhere out there, maybe a dude named Bob in Ohio. I don't know. I've got to do my trademark bantering with my engineer, Zach. Zach, you ready?
Go ahead.
All right, man. So first of all, I want to remind everybody out there, including you, Zach, this is better than midget wrestling and guaranteed not to trigger anybody. The Perseid meteor shower is peaking last night and tonight. So everyone's talking about the eclipse right now, which is going to be in about a week, which I want to go to. I'm going to take some time off work and participate that with my lovely family. But there's a really, really, really good meteor shower tonight as well. So if you have some clear viewing and you can get away from light pollution, and if you happen to be listening live, folks, tonight, Saturday, August 12th, the meteor shower is peaking. Were either of you guys aware of that, John?
No, definitely. Yeah. I love the meteor shower thing. Unfortunately, no, the eclipse is actually going to be the day after Gen Con ends. So I'm going to be in Indianapolis for that. But I think I can't get far enough south to be like in a full eclipse then.
Well, we're here in Little Rock, and Mike, I'll let you chime in on that in here in a second. In Little Rock, we get like 90% of the eclipse. I'm debating whether driving a few hours north to try to get into the actual full thing or anyway. But Mike, were you aware of that meteor shower tonight?
Only a little bit. I see things that kind of pass through my Yahoo feed, and that is about the extent of it. Right now there's just so much going on that it's hard to worry about things on other galaxies and planets and other spaces when I think about what's going on in my very office. So
Okay, I got you. Well, just want to remind people of that. The eclipse is taking up all the news. And Zach, I think I texted you this, but I did see last weekend I watched Ghost in the Shell.
Yes.
And I watched Power Rangers.
Uh-huh.
Power Rangers. I always got to give Zach a hard time about Power Rangers because he loves them. I thought Ghost in the Shell was visually amazing, but how do you make that movie dull? They made it kind of tedious and dull. Yeah. I did not think it was that great of a movie.
They try to explain everything. When the movie, it's a mystery.
Yeah, but it just didn't, I don't know. I was kind of bored with it, other than the visuals. But now Power Rangers, despite myself, now I'm not saying either of these movies is a great movie. But Power Rangers was a big, dumb, fun movie. And I enjoyed watching it.
Okay.
Now, I want to know how much Krispy Kreme paid them. I want to know, because have either of you guys seen this movie? The
Power Rangers?
Yeah,
no.
the movie version. Evidently, the final battle happens at Krispy Kreme. And they say Krispy Kreme like 50 times in the movie. So I want to know how much money, what kind of product placement that was there. But it's just a big, dumb, fun movie. And I barely know anything about the Power Rangers, but I enjoyed it. And dude, at the end, Zach, when they slapped Rita,
oh my
was that not the slap of they slapped her into orbit? That was pretty sweet.
I don't want to hear that. No.
Okay. I loved that slap. So Mike, have you seen any of these movies?
No, I haven't, and I'm trying not to. Actually, you had me at Krispy Kreme. If there's a big product placement of Krispy Kreme at the end, I think I can probably pass on that one and not lose too much geek credit, I guess.
They're like literally like the Earth's about to blow up, and they're like, "Hurry, we have to get to Krispy Kreme." I'm not lying. So anyway, that's enough of that. Let's turn on the super secret microphone in the Shane Plays newsroom and see if they're working today. They're working hard on a Saturday. Love those guys and gals. Folks, remember, for every $1 of support the show gets by Patreon, the news team gets a penny an hour raise. That's a win-win for everybody. Now, the first news item I'm actually going to hand over to my guests, Mike and Jon. I hear tell the grapevine is revealing to me that you guys have a new book coming out sometime in the somewhat near future. Would you like to tell us about that?
I'm sure Mike would love to tell us all about this wonderful project that he actually got me involved in. And so since he got me
you got
into
sucked
Mike,
into it despite yourself.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's an unholy alliance. There's no doubt about it. I'll say some high-level things about it, and Jon can say smarter things about it. Let's put it that way. So it's a partnership between a filmmaker, Kyle Newman, who was the director and writer of Fanboys, Barely Lethal, a number of other things. My own brother, Sam Witwer, who, of course, Shane, you've talked to him before, and me and Jon. And we all got together, and we're doing a book called Dungeons & Dragons: The Visual History, which is exactly that. It's actually the history of D&D, the entire 40-plus year history, but as told largely through the visuals. So that could be anything from the artwork, the people, the places, the ephemera. We really cover a lot of ground with imagery. So it's a really exciting project. And we've been working on it for, many, many months with 10 Speed Press, which is an imprint of King Random House, in partnership with Wizards of the Coast. So that's we've been working on that for a while. It just kind of broke news this last week or so, and it should be coming out, I want to say, mid to late next year. Fall
mid to late next year. Now, is this going to be one of those big vault type books that it's just packed with, like, I don't know if you're familiar with these, but they'll be like the history of Marvel Comics or the history of this football team or whatever, and it's almost like somebody put a scrapbook together for you. Is it going to be like that, or? I mean,
yeah, I'd like to think that it'll have a bit of that, the feel of a visual history book that tries to take things on from what the product looked like, what the people who did it looked like, what the advertisements. I love period advertisements because they just convey so much about what it felt like to be there.
Yeah. Time capsules.
And so, yeah, it'll be like a coffee table kind of book. It'll be big, it'll be colorful, and it'll just be full of cool things. Some cool things you've seen before, some things coming from the vaults of myself and other collectors that are not widely known or have not been widely seen that I think will be really awesome. So
excellent. So mid to late next year. Now, Mike, I want to make sure that I go over this again. Now, it's yourself, it's Jon, and then it's your brother Sam Witwer. Who a lot of people probably know from his acting and his video game work. He's on Battlestar Galactica. He's been in Once Upon a Time. He was the voice and the features of Starkiller and The Force Unleashed, among many other things. And then who was the other person that's helping you out?
It's Kyle Newman, who's
the filmmaker,
director, and a Hollywood writer, filmmaker, right?
Excellent.
And he was actually originally he's the one that came to me with this kind of overarching idea a little over a year ago. Is how it all kind of started, and things really fell into place in a way that none of us could have really planned. Quite honestly, it really congealed very naturally.
Nice.
And we've been having a blast on this thing, but we have been just working our tails off to make sure we really get all of the best stuff together. As Jon suggested already, when you think about how you visually convey something as broad as D&D over 40-some years.
Right.
I mean, you're really covering a lot of ground.
Yep.
So it has been damn exciting. But, we're really, really kind of high on this thing. I think it's going to really play well.
And since we've had multiple generations of D&D players now, there's probably people who will get this book who will get to see that great stuff from the late 70s and the 80s, like those great advertisements in the comic books. The total little story, or, even there was some advertisements way back in the day where Gary Gygax got his daughter as the model, and there's some really cool stuff out there that people have probably never seen. And you're right. The visual, like the way the art style and everything has evolved for D&D over the years, it's like a time capsule when you see that stuff, and it really takes you back, if you live through it. Or it'll just be fascinating to see if you didn't, and you're like kind of a newer player, and you're like, oh, that's what it used to look like compared to now or whatever. So, well, that's...
and I'll say this, Shane, this is largely a credit to John, but when you look at things this way, I have to say we stumbled on a lot of, I think, really unique information. Out of just being a great visual chronicle, it'll have this, it'll have nostalgia, it'll have all kinds of things. But what I think is really interesting is that there's really a story here that we've kind of stumbled on in a way that I don't think we necessarily expected. And so even what's written on the page, right, it will be fairly. I know it's interesting to us, and I think it'll be pretty darn interesting to the readers as well.
Okay. Well, when you have a known publication date and it's getting close to that time, you guys have an open invite to come back on, and we'll promote that. Because just I love talking about the history of D&D and RPGs. I could do it all day long. So, and with an hour show, we never get to go as deep as I want to. So, just put that as a blank check that you guys can come back on, when it's about ready to come on, and you can bring whoever you want with you or whatever. So I'd love to have a show on that. I also wanted to give John a chance to talk about this D&D museum that you're doing at, the Gen Con 50, the 50th Gen Con this coming weekend, correct?
I mean, we're getting into some serious anniversaries here.
Yeah.
When things start being 50 years old. I mean, you really start to think differently about this community when it has an institution that's lasted like half a century. Makes you wonder kind of what people will be thinking, when it's Gen Con 100, right? And they look back at this. But yeah, so this isn't just a D&D museum. This is a museum of the history of gaming, really, of all the games that have informed Gen Con. And, obviously D&D weighs pretty large in that, especially in the 70s and 80s. But we don't want to neglect this little game called Magic the Gathering, right, that came around in 1993 and completely transformed Gen Con and the entire game.
Well, it also saved a lot of game shops when it came out. So it was a real boon to a lot of people, including to D&D ultimately, right? Because Peter Atkinson was able to then buy TSR and kind of resurrect D&D from what might not have been its finest moment. Well, every institution, whether it's an IP or a game or a company, goes through good times and bad. And right now I'm thrilled that we are in a major gaming renaissance right now. So it's like it's firing on all cylinders. So you're doing you have this amazing this museum you're doing at Gen Con, right? That actually has like the original paintings of like the original Dungeon Master's Guide or Player's Handbook or something. Tell us kind of some of that you're doing.
Yeah, well, again, we just kind of took a bit of a whip round of some of our friends, and Peter Atkinson and I have kind of he owns Gen Con now. He and I have kind of been looking after this museum concept, and we've identified a ton of just amazing stuff that we're putting in a recreated horticultural hall. So like back in 1968, when they first held Gen Con, it was in this little place in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin called the Horticultural Hall.
The Horticultural Hall. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And I've been in there. I was just in there actually in March for a little kind of preview party of this. And you can fit maybe 150, 200 people in there comfortably. We got 60,000, 65,000 people coming to Gen Con now, right? So, but what we've done is we've staged this museum in a little replica of the Horticultural Hall. You're going to walk through the facade of it, which we're staging on the gridiron of Lucas Oil Field in downtown Indianapolis. And once you pass through this little facade, there's all these display cases that kind of cover how we've separated out into these 6 eras of Gen Con. And so you'll kind of be able to look at wargaming, you'll be able to look at the RPG era, you'll be able to look at collectible card games and so on, kind of as you go around. And we have the original painting of Dungeon Master's Guide, which our good friend Paul Stormberg is bringing. We have the first draft of D&D, which I'll be bringing.
Oh, wow.
We have a lot of really cool stuff that'll be on display.
Now, when you say this first draft, is that Dave Arneson's notes that he mailed to Gary Gygax that Gary Gygax said he couldn't make heads or tails of, so he had to call Dave? And I mean, what do you actually have when you say you have the first draft?
Well, I have the thing that Gary Gygax sent to Dave Arneson. That was the first document that said Dungeons and Dragons on it that had a rule set in it, which he identified anyways, the first draft in the cover letter for it. So, I mean, and the great thing about it is it not only has, the things Gary typed up from those notes and from his own imagination and his players' campaigns and so on, but also some hand corrections and ideas he jotted down. And then when Dave got it, Dave jotted down some other ideas. So there are some pages even where you can see both of their handwriting, with different pens at different times, marking it up. And that's when you know that you're looking at the real thing, the real history.
Huge. Yeah, that is cool. Yeah, the stuff that Dave sent to Gary wasn't the first draft of the rules. It was just, he ran Gary and some people through that first proto D&D, and Gary's like, well, we got to do something with this. And so, Gary or Dave gave him some notes and then Gary turned it into the actual draft. So, well, I'll tell you, I want to move us on just because I want to make sure to have some time to talk about our main topic. So what I want to do, and folks, that'll be at Gen Con 50. Is there if people go to Gen Con 50, is that part of the show, or do they need to pay an entrance fee, or how does that work to check out this museum?
It's part of the show. You can just go.
Nice.
I mean, we have some guided tours, which I fear are now all sold out. I'm doing some of the guided tours myself. But again, this is on Lucas Oil Field. You just walk out of the convention center into the stadium, and that's where you'll find it.
And that is so cool. So, I definitely got the right guys for this topic today. Okay, I'm going to introduce this topic, and we got to get to a break here in a little bit so I can pay the bills. But guys, I reached out a few weeks ago, and I said, okay, I have an idea for the show, and you're both like, yeah, that sounds really cool. So here's what we talked about. I wanted to just do kind of a thought experiment because D&D has had such a major impact, not only on role-playing games and the gaming hobby in general, but also pop culture. It can be argued, and I see more and more people arguing this, the tremendous influence that D&D has had on pop culture in general, and other entertainment types that have nothing to do with RPGs or board games. A lot of our filmmaker or actors today are saying that, they learned how to tell stories playing D&D and, that kind of thing. So it's touched a lot of areas. And I said, what if D&D had never been published? What would we still have role-playing games? Would we have an RPG hobby? What might have changed? And the, for one of a nail, the kingdom was lost moment that I proposed was, Gary Gygax had to borrow money to start TSR, correct?
Basically, yeah.
Yeah. So what if, like, all of the other Genesis moments were there? There was all this wargaming community. All of the elements were in place for the first RPG game to get published. People were aware of what Gary and Dave were doing. Dave had his Blackmore thing, and then, Gary was codifying the rules and playtesting it with people. And so the word was getting around in the gaming community, but Gary could never, for whatever reason, couldn't borrow the money to start TSR. So D&D never got published. It just remained a hobby kind of pet project of his on the side, because he's the one, as I understand it, that took the bull by the horns and said, Dave, we got to do something with this. We got to publish this. We got to get this out there. This is big. So, like, what I feel, go ahead. Yeah.
So he doesn't partner with Don Kay, and they don't bring in Brian Bloom. So those things never happen. He gets to a point where he's developed it with Dave Arneson and he's shopping it, but it never gets picked up. Is that where we get? Yeah,
it never, because he took it to like Avalon Hill, and he took it, and nobody wanted to publish it. And so he's like, well, I'll publish it. But for whatever reason, like Brian Bloom or Donald Kay, he couldn't get the money. So TSR never became a company, and D&D never got officially published. But, let's say that, the draft of the rules made it out in the wargaming community. So, that's what, now I feel, and we could talk about this after the break, I feel enough elements for role-playing games were out there that somebody else would have eventually published a role-playing game. That's what I feel. But would it have been a fantasy game? I don't know. Would it have been as codified and as structured as D&D? I don't know, because based on what I understand, Gary Gygax is the person that really brought a lot of structure, to hit the games that he worked on. And Dave Arneson was more like, well, let's just kind of have some fun. And Gary Gygax was like, well, I think we need a table for that. That's kind of how I understand it. So, having set that up, I want to go to a break and then come back, and then let's take a stab at what we think would have happened. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
The smell of mildew emanates from wet stone walls. The only choices before you are to enter the door to the north or travel back up the stairs from whence you came.
Okay. I go to the door to the north.
In this room you encounter an event promoter.
Arkansas RPG Con is the Arkansas convention for all tabletop role-playing games. Arkansas RPG Con will be held on Saturday, October 21st at the Gene Moss Building, located at 913 East Sevier Street in Benton, Arkansas. Early bird tickets are just $7, so visit arpgcon.com for all the details about Arkansas RPG Con.
Okay. Well, I guess I go to Arkansas RPG Con.
Yeah, that does sound pretty fun.
Comic book lovers, visit thewildstars.com today. From the mind of author and comic book industry expert Michael Tierney, it's not just a comic book, it's a comic book novel. The Wild Stars is sci-fi and so much more. Learn the explanations behind UFOs and space gods. This isn't the Twilight Zone. This is the region of the Milky Way galaxy known as the Wild Stars. We guarantee you've never read anything like it. The complete comic book novel took 20 years to tell, with one reviewer noting, the story of the Wild Stars stretches ambitiously across space and time, from small-town murders to the destruction of planets, with every event given multiple layers of meaning. If you haven't read The Wild Stars, you're missing out. Visit thewildstars.com today.
The die is cast.
Plunge into worlds of fantastic adventure where dragons lie and the undead stalk the shades of your mind's imagines. Where creatures of legend plunder wealth through the horror of their passage. Monsters grim and foul hold the ecstasy of gold and the renown of glory. All this and more awaits you and your friends in the unlimited, fantastic world of the Castles and Crusades role-playing game from Trollord Games. Visit your friendly local game store or Trollord.com to get your copy today. A rules-light, adaptable game that has stood the test of time. 12 years in constant publication with no new additions. Castles and Crusades is the original, easy-to-play attribute check system. Join us and unleash your imagination. Visit your friendly local game store or Trollord.com to get your copy of Castles and Crusades today. Shane Plays Radio is blessed to have sponsors, and we appreciate them very much. However, did you know that you can also support the show as an individual for as little as $1 an episode? Simply go to patreon.com/ShanePlays.
Hey, we're back on Shane Plays Geek Talk Radio, a journey into the things we love. If you'd like to join the conversation, you can call 501-823-0965, or you can tweet me at Shane Plays. I'd be glad to include your questions or comments. Got a different kind of show today that I've really been excited about for a while. We just set it up before the break. I'm joined by Michael Witwer and Jon Peterson. They are D&D and RPG historians and authors. Michael wrote Empire of the Imagination, which is a biography of Gary Gygax, and he's working on other stuff that we talked about. And Jon Peterson, among other things, wrote Playing at the World, which is a very scholarly yet readable approach to saying, you know, how did we get RPGs? Where did it all come from? And he approaches from a scholarly perspective. And what we talked about was, what if it's kind of, you know, I had a few weeks ago, we had a Twilight Zone episode, and Zach, I'm actually not going to ask for the music to save time. We had thought about playing the Twilight Zone theme to set this up, but I'm not going to do it. And this is kind of Twilight Zone. So imagine a world where it's, you know, it's a parallel universe where everything happened the same, except that Gary Gygax could not get the money together to start TSR to publish D&D. So D&D was there in the hobbyist circle, but it never actually got published, never made it out there, never sold 16 million copies in the 80s, never had the cartoon, never had all these authors and people and all these people, you know, playing D&D. So we probably like, what would have happened in this alternate history? Would we have ever ended up with official RPG hobby? How would it have affected pop culture? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take turns just to make it easier on you guys so you know when to go in. John, why don't you lead us off with your initial knee-jerk thoughts on what would have happened? Would another RPG have been published? And if so, what do you think it might have looked like?
Well, so I think I agree with what you said right before the break, which is, once these ideas had gotten out there. So if we stipulate that the draft of D&D existed alone, that Gygax and Arneson had worked on this and that had circulated in the hobby community, I think we would have ended up with something very much like D&D. And there are very good reasons to think so. It's because it actually happened. There was, one example, this guy, Craig Van Grastek, who was in Minneapolis. He played with a group that had played with Arneson's group. But Craig didn't actually know that there was this game called D&D. And they create this phenomenon. We call it now Minneapolis Dungeon. They just called it the Game of Dungeon at the time.
Okay.
But he actually put together his own rule set for this and started circulating it without ever having seen a copy of D&D or even knowing it existed. And he circulated this at the Worldcon, the science fiction convention, in 1974. And there are other examples like this of people that were just kind of peripheral to the playtesting environment who got to experience a game or got to see copies of the rules, and from that branched out and built something on their own. Of course, once Craig published his rules to the Game of Dungeon, somebody said in the next month's fanzine, "Hey, dude, there's this game called D&D. You should totally check it out."
Now, is this is this the board game dungeon that we're talking about? That
no.
Okay.
That's a whole other thread we could pursue of what if like Gary and Dave had never published even gotten the draft together. We could argue Dave McGarry's dungeon might have inspired something. And that was a different thing, the board game. Now, this rules to the Game of Dungeon, you can find it on my blog, actually. I worked with Craig to get the original kind of draft of it put into shape so people could download it and read it and even try to play it. It was like a D&D dungeon crawling game.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, all right. So John has made the case that, we would have gotten something. Stephen King said something, I think, in the novel Christine. He was talking about, I think, steam engines and cotton gins. Like multiple people invented the steam engine at basically the same time. And cotton gins kind of the same thing. So all the elements are in place. So I think we definitely would have gotten something. My personal feeling, and then Mike, I'll turn it over to you. I think we would have gotten a role-playing game, but I think some of the elements that may not have been in there. Gary Gygax was from what I understand, very heavy on codification. We got to have levels for this. We got to have this. We got to have that. We got to have a chart for this, that, and the other. I wonder if and he's also the one that was looking through a school supply catalog one day and found all of the various dice. It was like, that's what I need, because he had been using this method where you pulled tokens or something out of a bag to simulate the 5% chance of any D20 roll kind of thing. So I'm not sure that the multifaceted dice that we associate so much role-playing games would have made it in, because that was something he brought in. And in fact, didn't Holmes D&D use chits for randomizing or something like that? So there were other ways before the isohedral, I think I'm saying that wrong, the multifaceted dice that we so associate came along. Those didn't necessarily have to be part of the gaming community. I wonder if the first thing we would have gotten would have been more of a rules light game like Tunnels and Trolls, right? Because Tunnels and Trolls was purposefully, the guy's like, I like D&D, but it's the rules are too crazy. I want to do something that's a little bit, less heavy on the rules. And then Mike, there was a time it was me and you and Matt Barton and some other people, and your brother were talking, and Sam, your brother, really went on, he's like, look, why, this whole level thing was crazy, because you had levels of dungeons and you had levels of spells and then you had character levels, and it was crazy. So I think some of that might not have been part, because right now that stuff is just baked in to the psyche of the role-playing game hobby. You know what I mean? So I wonder if it would have been, it still would have been nerdy and geeky, but I wonder if it had been quite as codified and structured. So that was just kind of some thoughts I had. So Mike, what do you think would have happened?
Well, firstly, Shane, what a dystopian concept you come up with here to have us think about a world with no D&D. What a terrible thing that you've placed in our minds.
Yeah, I know.
Nightmares about it for weeks.
I'm trying to make little kids lock themselves in the bathroom and cry.
Exactly, right. Yeah. I'm really glad you started with John, honestly, because because nobody really understands the climate of what was happening right on the tip of D&D as much as John does. I've been to this in a few different ways because one thing that occurred to me is I was looking at the proliferation of war games and miniatures games that was happening, of course, right ahead of D&D. And so one thing that occurred to me was, well, so there have been more and more war games kind of produced. Avalon Hill was growing and growing. And, of course, Gen Con exists in this particular scenario, right? So there was always
Did you say Gen Con?
To build. I'm sorry?
Did you say Gen Con existed?
Yeah, so Gen Con exists at this point, right? So as of 1968. So what I was thinking was, well, so we would have seen a natural growth no matter what of gaming and miniatures just as what was happening. Because there was actually there was a community in place to nurture this type of thing, right? Barry had already created that with the formation of Gen Con. And then, of course, we've got Origins popping up, other things that come up shortly thereafter. So I thought about that no matter what, we would have gotten more and more miniatures and war game type stuff, including fantasy miniatures, right? Chainmail's out in this particular scenario also. So I thought about that and thought, okay, does that ever really become a big thing? And I was thinking, well, no, I still think those become very kind of very esoteric, very siloed hobbies, mainly because they require a lot of investment. They require just an ungodly amount of hours to table. Well, just like D&D does, but again, it was a different type of hobby. So I still think, okay, so I don't think a natural outgrowth comes out of that otherwise. But as John already suggested, if we're at a point where there's a draft circulating, we know for a fact there was people that caught onto this concept and said, this thing is awesome, we've got to do something with this. And so I guess my thought is that there's no doubt in my mind somebody would have tried to self-publish this on some level. It's a big difference, though, that it was Barry in particular, I think, that published this. You had talked about how he is looking through school supply catalogs, finding days. He was thinking about this game in
hey, Mike, let's do this. I can make out what you're saying, but I've got better headphones and stuff here in the studio. I think you're cutting out a little bit or getting a little distorted on your phone. Yeah, can you hang up, and then I'm gonna have Zach call you right back, just see if we can get a better connection on you, because this is really good stuff, and I don't want to have the listeners miss out on what you're saying.
Oh, no problem. Thanks.
All right, Zach, call him right back as soon as he disconnects. So what he was kind of saying, John, was that all the stuff was out there. Somebody would have self-published this, right? So did you understand him to saying that D&D would have gotten published regardless? It just may not have been by Gary Gygax?
Well, I mean, again, I think he's trying to point out, and he's catching a bit of a connotation I think I heard from you as well, that, Gary did have a unique style, right? And there are things Gary brought to the game that wouldn't be there if he hadn't done it.
Right.
And I mean, but if we stipulate that the draft that Gary produced in 1973 was already circulating, things like level, they would have been baked into it, right? And so somebody would have taken it. And I think, like you said, I mean, when I was talking about that Craig Van Grastek Rules to the Game of Dungeon, it is really stripped down and simplified like Tunnels and Trolls, right? And you can kind of easily imagine, somebody who wanted to publish a more fanish, less nerdy version of it, doing something that was more stripped down like that, because that's what happened. And it could be then that really Tunnels and Trolls, right? You imagine Ken St. Andre finding Rules for the Game of Dungeon instead of D&D, right? And saying, well, maybe I'll dial this up a bit, actually.
Right, yeah, it needs
and add a little
rules.
more crunch.
Yeah.
And now you end up with something, now Tunnels and Trolls is released basically in the same way, and it becomes the catalyst then for Traveler and for everything that follows.
So, well, right, yeah, and see, that's another thing I wanted to bring up. And hopefully we'll get Mike back before long, because I want his input on this too. D&D was, when it was first published, was basically a very Tolkien setting, right? In a lot of ways, D&D still is Tolkien, even though it's expanded and there's other ways to play it. Was all of the fantasy role play, because when most people think of role-playing games, they still think of fantasy, even though there's a bunch of other ones out there. That's kind of the default thing. Do you think there's a chance that we could have gotten a non-fantasy setting D&D game or a role-playing game that would have exploded and kind of set a different tone for the hobby down the road? Or do you think that it would have defaulted to basically a Tolkienish fantasy setting?
Well, so my counterfactual for that, and I don't want to cut Mike off if he's coming back in.
I think he's just joined us again. So,
is Sniper.
I'm back. Yeah, please, John, continue.
Okay.
Oh, great. Yeah. I'll let you weigh on this in a sec, Mike. So, there was this great game that came out in 1966 called Modern War in Miniatures by this guy named Mike Corns. And Corns did something for modern war games that was like an RPG. And there's like a dungeon master, they called it a judge, and you like told the judge what you wanted to do, and he told you what happened. And it happened in that same like dialogue as D&D. And each turn was supposed to represent like 2 seconds. So it was a very immediate thing where it's like, okay, I've got my rifle. Oh, I see the German. Okay, I start shooting him. And I mean, people like James Dunnigan were kind of riffing on Corns when they designed games like Sniper, which is a 1973 game. It was an SPI board war game, but it was down to the individual soldier level. And it's real easy to imagine that if this whole thing hadn't been blindsided by fantasy, right, that somebody might have taken that and created something that felt pretty close to an RPG. Now, it's not clear to me it would have set the world on fire the way that a fantasy RPG did. And fantasy, I think, is a major ingredient in why it set the world on fire.
Right, I agree with that.
It's real hard to differentiate what you see in Corns and maybe what you see when you really break war games down to that individual level like Sniper did that is so different from an RPG.
All right. Now, Mike, I think that, if I had to boil down my opinion on what would have happened, I think if the first few or the first RPG that really caught people's attention was not fantasy based, I think there would have been some popularity, for sci-fi or war game or whatever. But I just feel like that the hobby wouldn't have blazed up as quickly and as widespread as it did. It may have been a little bit less impactful because there is something about that fantasy element that just helped it explode. But anyway, Mike, before you got cut off, you were talking about, that the possibility of somebody maybe even publishing D&D with a different company because the rules were out there. And then you were talking about, Gary introducing the dice by finding them in a school catalog. So did you want to add anything to that, or do you want to add to the conversation on, would it necessarily have been a fantasy game that would have been our first RPG?
Well, boy, that's a good one, and certainly another thread that deserves a lot of attention. But to finish that earlier thought, and I apologize for the gremlins.
It happened. Yeah, that happens. Yeah, no worries.
If you couldn't hear me, by the way, I was saying unbelievable, brilliant things that you'll never hear again. I couldn't repeat. So,
man, it's just how life works. Yeah, it's just how life works.
So what I think is important, though, is that it was Gary that built the first D&D, and not because, again, not for any other reason that. Let me put it this way: it was his ability to build community that was a big part of D&D's proliferation, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't coincidence that the same guy that founded Gen Con was the guy that put this new gaming concept into the market in the way that it did, and the way that it caught fire.
Right.
So to that end, I think that's extremely important because it alters the entire trajectory of how games catch on. So,
and you're narrowing down into what what I kind of feel the main thesis is. If you remove Gary from the mix and to Dave to a certain extent and TSR, what would have happened? And I still feel that we would have gotten the hobby, but it wouldn't be on the level that we have it now.
I mean, I think for sure Marty McFly is never born. I'm pretty clear on that.
Yeah. But, we never even get a DeLorean. And we don't even have a DeLorean manufactured by DeLorean Motors. It's terrible. In fact, the axis of the Earth tilts and we go into the sun. It's bad. So thank goodness for Gary. So, well, here's one thing I want to do. I've got to get us to another break so we can come back and have about 10 minutes to bring this home. I want to come at it from a different angle. Without Gary, we get no TSR. And people can say good things or bad things about TSR, but TSR sold 16 million copies of D&D in the 80s. And, so what would the hobby look like? Let's look at it like, okay, let's look at what TSR did for the hobby. TSR never existed, so it's not just Gary, it's TSR. Cause at a certain point, Gary turned the reins over and he went off to Hollywood to try to expand the brand and all that. We'd have never had Donald Most, voicing Eric in the cartoon. I mean, this is big stuff, folks, and this will make you cry. So, all right, well, let me get to a break and we'll come back and try to kind of bring this home. And if there's any other angles you guys want to come at this from, feel free. These are just, kind of thoughts I'm throwing out there. All right. Some goblins are your friends. Game Goblins is Central Arkansas's premier retailer of Magic the Gathering, Warhammer 40K, board games, card games, RPGs, miniatures, and hobby accessories. Call Game Goblins at 501-224-GAME or visit them online at gamegoblins.com. Conveniently located at 1121 South Bowman, right on the corner of Bowman and Canis in West Little Rock. And staffed by friendly employees, Game Goblins has expanded their store size, and there's plenty of room for exciting inventory and tables for play space. You'll like that space because Game Goblins has gaming events every day of the week. For all of your gaming needs, I heartily recommend Game Goblins. Make sure to check out their customer loyalty program that rewards you based on your actual purchases. Game Goblins earns your business and keeps it. First-time customers, mention Shane Plays and receive $10 off your purchase of $50 or more. Tell them Shane Plays sent you. Hey, welcome back to Shane Plays Geek Talk Radio, a journey into the things we love. We are in the role-playing game Twilight Zone. We're talking about with authors and historians, D&D authors and RPG authors and historians, I should say, Michael Witwer and Jon Peterson. And we're thinking through the concept of what would role-playing games and by default, pop culture in extension look like. What would the hobby look like today if D&D had never actually been published? The concept was there, the rules have been come up with, but for whatever reason, TSR never started. They couldn't get the money together. And before the break, we said, well, let's kind of focus on TSR. Because TSR, a lot of people are like, they were going to go out and then Wizards of the Coast bought them. But for at least a decade, if not longer, TSR was, really, getting the hobby out there in a big, big way. And you can say what you will about the management or this or that, or them, what did you call it, John? The ambush at something Springs,
Sheridan Springs.
Springs, where they got rid of Gary, where he said, how many majority shares do I have again? Right before the hammer came down, which is a fantastic article. Go out to the Playing at the World blog, folks, and read the ambush at Sheridan Springs if you want to get some insight on how Gary was pushed out of his own company. But, TSR published not only D&D, but, they did Top Secret and Star Frontiers and Gamma World. And, they did a lot of public, we would never ever had the Forgotten Realms with all the novels with, and the Dragonlance. And we never had any of that. So not just the game, but, the kind of the pop. Think about all the computer games that were either directly licensed off D&D or influenced by D&D. There were people like back in the day, like, oh, D&D, and they were making like D&D mainframe games. So I think there'd be a pretty big ripple effect. But knowing, and we keep coming back to Gary Gygax. Now, Gary Gygax was not the only creator of D&D. Dave Arneson was absolutely critical and essential to D&D coming into being. But Gary Gygax was the person who had, who made it the phenomenon that it is through, forming a company and getting it out there. Right. And he also contributed to the rules quite a bit. So, what we're really saying is, what would the hobby look like if Gary Gygax and TSR had never been involved? Would it have gotten as big as it did? Mike, I'll let you take lead on that one.
Yeah. So, really broadly, what I think, it's impossible to know which way this would have gone. It sounds like we're all kind of in agreement on some level that we do think something would have gotten published out there, something that you would probably define as a role-playing game. But, again, I guess I'm inclined to think it would have stayed very siloed, very hobbied, in quotes, very similar to what the wargaming and miniatures community was looking like at the time. So I guess the thing that I really think about really on a very big picture is simply this. D&D came about from the right people at the right time in the right exact community and package, you might say. Mm-hmm. That is, i.e., it came out from the guy that was running this Gen Con convention. He was talking to the right people, and it was even codified in the right ways to be kind of playable across the country if you had never seen a group play this game. And so... Well, he also
he was unhappy with his career, so he had that extra fire under his rear to go for it.
Yeah, I think it was all of the right stuff together that made this phenomenon happen when it did. And so I guess the thing that keeps going through my mind is, no, I don't believe for a moment that the hobby would have accelerated the way it did, even if something else had come out in a different way. I don't think James Dallas Egbert III played it at Michigan State in 1979 because the game wouldn't have been as big, or it would have been a different type of game. And then, all of those controversies wouldn't have started, and the snowball effect would have occurred. And so I guess I have a lot of trouble believing it would have ever been a big mainstream fad in the 80s that it was. It would have ever gotten the notice of John Carmack and John Romero, who based a lot of things on it. From
Doom. Doom was based on a D&D campaign.
Hit points. Yeah. I mean, I think it is really far-reaching. I'll turn it over to John here. I mean, there's a lot you could say about this, but I do think the very particular pieces that came around with D&D, the way it did, I think it's huge to think what would happen if it didn't exist. I think it would have never really gotten beyond the tables of people playing in these really small groups.
Well, I think that
a chance anyway.
I'm going to turn it over to John, but I think that, I've got to land on, again, we would have had RPGs in some sense, but like you said, it would have been silent. It would be like what wargaming or even maybe Warhammer is today. It's out there. People know about it, but it's not the massive phenomenon that it is. Right. And the lady who bothered about D&D would have had more free time on her hand to go do something else better in her life. So, all right, John, what do you think? I'll give you about a minute and a half here to give us your final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think I do agree. I mean, I think I wouldn't put it all on Gary in the sense of, since you were speaking to TSR more broadly, TSR was a pretty amazing outfit in terms of the original talent. They got concentrated there.
Agreed.
You had not just Gary, but you had Tim Kask, Dave McGarry, you had Mike Carr, you had Dave Arneson, you had Dave Sutherland, right? And I mean, I think they together there in that formative period, 1976 or so, really made it happen. And I don't want to discount Bloom either, because the Bloom family, they put some money in initially, but then in 75, they put a lot of money.
Yeah, I don't want to discount them.
Well,
oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, without the business acumen, which wasn't exclusively Gary's, right? A lot of it came from these structures that kind of Brian and Kevin had inherited from their father. Like, that had a lot to do with how D&D managed to get big and get in front of people. Like a Flying Buffalo, a GDW, a Chaosium, it's unclear to me they could have scaled the way that D&D needed to get where it got by 79 without that Bloom family expertise and money behind it.
Yeah, and people, it's like there was a fallout. Gary's pushed out, but for many, many, many years, the Blooms and all that, they were a good force in it. But they were more in it for the business. From what I understand, they weren't as passionate about the hobby as, say, Gary or some of the other folks were. Well, I think that's been a good, been a good discussion. We all agree that something would have happened. It boggles me to think that I would never have played D&D in my entire life, because it's been such a part of my my pop culture and my entertainment and all that now. So anyway, guys, thanks so much. I hope that the museum goes great next weekend at Gen Con, John, and I hope that y'all's book, I will pencil it in. We'll have you back on the show to talk about your book when it comes out. I got to do this to you. We got to do the bad joke of the week. You ready?
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Why didn't the lifeguard save the hippie?
Lifeguard hippie. You got me.
Because he was too far out.
Oh.
All right. We got to wrap, guys. We'll catch you later.
TSR and Dungeons & Dragons veteran Frank Menser on his friend Gary Gygax and the impact of Dungeons & Dragons.
In the broader sense, though, as I mentioned earlier, again, I strongly feel that I can trace the family games of the 50s and before that into the culture that produced the wargamers, and then this creation of chainmail, which produced Dungeons & Dragons, which then inspired so many others. The early movies, Star Wars, came out inspired in part by, this sort of action-adventure stuff. And that gave rise to lots of science fiction games, piggybacking off of D&D's popularity. Personal and home computers then started appearing. We moved from the TRS-80 to the first Apples, and all of this happened. And what do you do first in entertainment on that? Well, there's this D&D stuff is big, so let's do some fantasy games. And the science fiction games, there it comes off of D&D to a game called Traveller, science fiction role-playing. And then that other games in that genre being translated and providing ideas for computer games, and more decisions on the part of studio heads to do more science fiction based and more fantasy based games as a result of that popularity and these phenomena spawning directly from Dungeons and Dragons to break through that, to make this a family type pastime for almost as big as, in some respects, as Monopoly or other great classic family games. You can trace back all of this to Gary's decision to stop selling insurance, to not be a shoe repairman on the side, to put all his time into starting a company to publish, okay, sorry Gary, but war game rules that weren't going to sell, but also this break thing that started as just the fantasy game and became the breakthrough game of the 70s and in fact the latter half of the 20th century. My friend Gary changed the world. This will be remembered in the long run.
Shane Plays Radio is blessed to have sponsors, and we appreciate them very much. However, did you know that you can also support the show as an individual for as little as $1 an episode? Simply go to patreon.com/ShanePlays.